Cuban President Raul Castro said Cuba wants to strengthen bilateral relations with China on the basis of mutual political trust. Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte said Xi's election shows China and the Chinese people have confidence in his leadership. He said he hopes cooperation between the Philippines and China can be expanded. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi said China and Egypt should deepen cooperation to benefit the people of the two countries. Czech President Miloš Zeman said he believes China will have a brighter future under Xi Jinping's leadership. He said the partnership between the two countries continues to produce concrete results and hope for stronger relations.
Well, let's get you more perspective on China's political season. I'm joined live in the studio by Dr. Adam Olo. He's an international relations expert and political scientist at the University of Nairobi. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr.
Thanks
Olo.
for having me.
Well, China's political season, it's now over. Do you expect a continuation of China's foreign policy toward Africa in terms of win-win cooperation?
Yeah, I think that has been the China policy since the end of the Cold War, and more so since 2000, when the Forum for Chinese and African Cooperation was put in place. And basically, China moved away from an ideological foreign policy to more of a transformational foreign policy in terms of economic cooperation and development with African countries, in which it would claim that, unlike the West, the Africans would also benefit from such a cooperation, and I don't see them changing from that.
So give us a few details of this transformational change.
Well, I think that some of the details of the transformational change, if you are to look at the agreements that have been signed or agreed between China and Africa, for example, you have the Chinese-Africa Business Council, Joint Business Council that has been there. You also have a situation in which, if you look at the Chinese-African relation, there have been promises that you can say have been adhered to. Quite an example would be, for example, technology transfer and interest-free loans given by, for example, Exim Bank and so on, and also the infrastructural development that has been occurring in quite a number of African countries, South Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, to name just but a few.
Okay. How important is this continued strengthening of China-African relations to the Chinese leadership, would you say?
Well, basically, China is becoming a power ever since the Soviet Union receded or crumbled and Russia didn't replace it completely as the next power challenging the United States of America. China is very keen to expand its foreign policy and become a global power, so to speak. So to the extent that it can carve out Africa as one of the domains in which it is gaining ground and the West is receding, then to that extent, Africa becomes quite key to China in terms of continental and global power showmanship.
Okay, well, let's talk about the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, which takes place in Beijing this September. President Xi Jinping made several pledges in last year's forum. How well do you think China's done in fulfilling those pledges?
I think let me start by what some scholars have talked about as a negative, that except for South Africa and Ethiopia, the rest of the African countries and China itself have not had a monitoring policy in terms of making sure that the agreements that were put in place have been met. But I think that's the only negative, because if you look at the positives, then you'll find that the promise has been kept. First, let us look at the institutional perspective, that there's no, every 3 years since 2000, the year 2000 in which it came into place, there's always been a meeting, which shows kind of a commitment that it was not just a talk. Then secondly, if you look at from 2000, some of the promises, they have been made. Debt cancellation for the most poor African countries, to an extent, some of those debts have been done away with. If you look at having a tariff-free engagements of products getting into the Chinese market, to an extent that has been met. If you look at building the African Union Conference Center in Addis Ababa, that has been met. If you look at the financing of peace initiatives in Africa, that has partly been met. If you look at technology partnerships, to an extent that has been met. If you look at promoting cultural cooperation, I think the Confucius Institute is really spreading in Africa. If you look at interest-free loans, I think that that is also being met. But of course, there'll be critics which will say that unlike the West, which gives aid and grants, but also looks at the human rights situation in Africa before they extend the same, China has been very clear that it doesn't mix business with politics, and therefore, to that extent, those who are pro-human rights have said that China has done a disfavor. But it depends on where you sit.
On your perspective. Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Adams-Olo, for coming in and giving us your thoughts on that, on this situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.